In June 1787, Thomas Jefferson sent a letter from Paris requesting that his daughters join him in France. Soon afterwards they arrived, accompanied by an enslaved teenage girl named Sally Hemings. Over the next 2 decades, she would bear 6 children widely believed to be Jefferson's, and become the woman at the center of one of the most explosive controversies in American history. But who was Sally Hemings, and what really happened between her and the founding father? We don't really know when Sally Hemings was born. By the 18th century, there were a growing array of records which allow us to determine what people's date of birth was, notably baptismal records, but this only tended to apply towards free Americans. We can't be entirely sure when enslaved people were or were not born, though in Sally Hemings' case, it is generally assumed that she was born around 1773 in Charles City County in the English colony of Virginia. For context, at this time Thomas Jefferson was 30 years old, while the Boston Tea Party, a key episode in the descent into the American Revolutionary War, occurred in December 1773. Thus, Sally grew up against the backdrop of war, though her formative years would have been much more peaceful in the 1780s and 1790s. Sally's mother was Elizabeth Hemings, an enslaved woman who was held in bondage by the Virginia plantation owner John Wales. It is believed that Elizabeth was born to a woman from West Africa and a white planter father. She had 6 children with her enslaver Wales, of whom Sally was one. This means that on her mother and maternal grandmother's side, Sally was of West African descent, but 3 of her 4 grandparents were of white European descent. Under the racial classifications of the time, she would have been considered a quadroon. Contemporary accounts consistently described her as good-looking and very light-skinned, reflecting her predominantly European ancestry. Sally never knew her father, as peculiar as the relationship would have been in any event. In May 1773, John Wales died. As such, he may have predeceased Sally. When he passed away, John had left large debts, and much of his estate and property was quickly sold off in order to reimburse his creditors. In settling the estate, Wales's son-in-law took possession of Elizabeth Hemings and her 6 children by Wales. This was none other than the future 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Back in 1770, he had begun courting Wales's daughter Martha, and the pair eventually married in 1772. At the time, Jefferson was a Virginia lawyer and plantation owner, but he was a young man, and not yet the national figure he became as a result of the war with Britain. Yet this seemingly incidental family connection marked the beginning of a relationship that would become one of the most controversial and debated stories in American history. History has a funny way of reminding us how much our lives can be shaped by decisions made years earlier, sometimes decisions we didn't fully understand at the time. Today, many of us are trapped in unfulfilling careers, with Sunday nights bringing that feeling of dread because you know another week of work is waiting. And even if you want change, it feels like you're stuck on a path you chose years ago. But what if there were another way? Well, with today's sponsor, Southern New Hampshire University, there is. SNHU is one of the largest accredited universities in the United States and offers some of the most affordable online tuition rates in the nation. There are no set class times, which means you can learn when and where it works best for your schedule. Many programs also emphasize real-world skills and practical experience that can help you stand out to future employers. And if you've already earned college credits, served in the military, or gained relevant professional experience, you may be able to transfer up to 90 credits, potentially saving both time and money on your degree. It's no surprise that SNHU has also been recognized by US News and World Report as one of the country's most innovative universities. So go to snhu.edu/forgotten lives to explore over 200 degree programs and find your path forward. At the time that Sally Hemings and her mother and siblings came into Jefferson's possession, he had just built his famous Monticello estate in the Albemarle County in Virginia. So, Sally grew up to a large extent here. Jefferson and his wife Martha Wales were extremely close, and shared interests like music, literature and horse riding. They would go on to have 6 children together, but tragically most of their children died in infancy. Only 2 of their children, Martha and Mary, known as Polly, lived into their adult years. There are a lot of gaps in our knowledge about what happened to Sally during her youth, but it is clear that she and her siblings were at the top of the social hierarchy amongst the slaves at Monticello, for the simple reason that they were Martha Wales's half-siblings. As such, Sally and her siblings worked in the household at Monticello, and she became close with Martha and Polly as they were growing up, as they were all similar in age. Yet the routines of plantation life were increasingly overshadowed by events beyond Virginia. The American Revolutionary War began in 1775, and a year later Thomas Jefferson emerged as a leading figure in the patriotic cause when he drafted the Declaration of Independence for the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Jefferson's rise continued in 1779, when he was elected governor of Virginia. Entrusted with leading the state through the darkest years of the Revolution, he faced British invasions, even as he sought to reshape Virginia's laws and institutions. Yet by the early 1780s, his wife Martha was ill and weak from her many pregnancies and a case of smallpox. It's said that Thomas was inconsolable about Martha's declining health and pain. Her health continued to worsen, and she died on September 6, 1782, aged 33. Before her death, Martha asked Jefferson never to remarry. The request was likely influenced by her own unhappy experiences with stepmothers, and her desire to spare her daughters a similar fate. Jefferson was devastated by her loss, and honoured her wish for the rest of his life, never taking another wife, or at least, not in name. In 1784, following the end of the Revolutionary War, Jefferson was appointed as the American minister to France, succeeding Benjamin Franklin. 3 years later, he arranged for his daughters to join him in Paris. In the summer of 1787, they arrived in Paris accompanied by Sally Hemings and her older brother James. Although slavery was not recognized in metropolitan France, and Sally could potentially have claimed her freedom under French law, she remained in Jefferson's household and served as a lady's maid to his daughter Martha. While in Paris, it's likely she accompanied Martha to formal social functions, and she was also learning French. We are not sure where she lived though. She may have stayed either at Jefferson's residence, the Hôtel de Lagnac, or the Abbaye de Pont-Vermont, where Martha and Polly were educated. It was during the family's years in Paris, amid the intrigue of Versailles in the twilight of the French monarchy, that Jefferson's relationship with Sally is generally believed to have begun. She would have been around 15 years old at the time, while Jefferson was in his mid-40s. The exact nature of their relationship remains a subject of debate. Although Sally occupied a somewhat different legal position in France than she would have in Virginia, the imbalance of power between the two was profound. Jefferson was a wealthy diplomat in his mid-40s, while Sally was an enslaved teenager in his household. Because of this, Sally would have had little say in the relationship, and couldn't really consent, though some historians argue that genuine affection may have developed between them over the years, though the true nature of their feelings can never be known with certainty. Whatever the truth, they remained in France until the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. By then, Sally was about 16 years old. As Jefferson made plans to leave France, Sally stood at a crossroads. One path led toward freedom in Europe, the other led back across the Atlantic to a life of slavery. Yet France was so far from home. Her mother, siblings, and extended family were all at Monticello, and those ties weighed heavily on her decision. According to the later recollections of her son Madison Hemings, Sally agreed to return only after Jefferson promised that any children they had together would one day be freed. It was a decision that would shape the rest of her life, and the lives of generations yet to be born. Sally's relationship with Thomas was extremely controversial and has been debated for 200 years. For 2 centuries, papers and books have appeared that have tried to deny the fact that Jefferson had a relationship with Sally. This has consequently become known as the Jefferson-Hemings controversy. In the 19th century and well into the 20th century, a majority of historians either ignored or challenged the idea that Jefferson fathered a separate family with one of his slaves. While it was hardly unusual for wealthy southern slave owners to father children with enslaved women during this period, what was out of the ordinary was the manner in which Jefferson conducted his relationship with Sally in a relatively open manner, and that it went on for so many years. After they returned to the United States, Sally is understood to have had 6 children via her relationship with Jefferson. The first, a daughter named Harriet, was born in 1795. She died 2 years later in December 1797. Another daughter, whose name was possibly Thenia, died in infancy. Of the 4 who lived beyond infancy, 3 were sons. These were William Beverly, born in 1798, James Madison in 1805, and Eston in 1808, while they also had another daughter named Harriet in 1801, reusing the name of their first, now deceased child. Hence, 3 of Sally's alleged children with Thomas were born when he was serving as President of the United States between 1801 and 1809. It was during Jefferson's presidency that the first allegations of the relationship circulated. Rumors had been going around since the 1790s, but in 1802, the journalist James T. Callender, a former ally turned political enemy, claimed that Jefferson had kept as his concubine one of his own slaves and fathered several children by her. The story quickly spread through the newspapers and became a favorite attack of Jefferson's critics. Jefferson himself never publicly addressed the accusations, though members of his family did. In the 1850s, his eldest grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, asserted that Sally's children had been fathered not by Jefferson, but by his nephew, Peter Carr. Nevertheless, there seems to be little doubt today from a wealth of documentary evidence, as well as DNA studies carried out by Sally's descendants in 1998, that Thomason was the father of Sally's children. One further unusual thing concerning Sally's children that seems to cement the idea that Thomas was their father comes from his farm book. This was a ledger he kept about his business affairs on his plantation in Virginia. He kept a record here of the births and deaths of slaves on his estate. Crucially, he noted the father of children born to enslaved women. But these details were omitted from the records pertaining to the children he almost certainly fathered with Sally. Despite the mountain of evidence to support the idea that Thomas was the father of Sally's 6 children, the theory did not gain widespread acceptance until the second half of the 20th century. As the civil rights movement gained ground in the US in the 1950s and 1960s, there was more discussion of this element of US presidential history, and it was widely written about. Yet, a small number of critics continue to dispute Jefferson's paternity. They note that DNA testing can identify the Jefferson male line, but cannot distinguish between individual Jefferson men, leading some to suggest alternative candidates such as Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph. Others have speculated that Sally Hemings may have had relationships with other men. However, most historians conclude that the combined documentary and genetic evidence strongly supports the view that Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children, even if absolute certainty remains impossible. The story of Sally Hemings might not be unique in American presidential history. It has been speculated that 4 or 5 other presidents also fathered children with slave women that they owned. For instance, William Henry Harrison, who was briefly president for 1 month before his death in 1841, potentially fathered several children with an enslaved woman named Dilcia. None of these other presidential slave children, though, can be confirmed. Jefferson was unusual in that his relationship with Sally appears to have endured for decades and resulted in 6 children, and the lives they had together at Monticello would prove every bit as intriguing as the controversy that surrounded them. Sally's life at Jefferson's plantation estate at Monticello in the 1790s was different to that of most slaves. A study in 2017 suggested that she lived in a room that was next to Thomas's in the manor house. She never married, and effectively became a pseudo-wife of Thomas, who, as mentioned, also did not remarry. The Hemings children lived in and around the house, and were treated separately from the vast majority of slaves at Monticello, just as Sally and her Hemings siblings had been decades earlier when she was growing up. The relationship between Thomas and Sally would have been sporadic between 1797 and 1809. He served as vice president between 1797 and 1801, and then as third president of the US between 1801 and 1809. Although Thomas did not go out of his way to cover up his relationship with Sally at Monticello, he knew there were limits to how open he should be. While he lived in Washington, she remained in Virginia, and there is no evidence that she ever visited the White House during his presidency. After his years in office, Jefferson returned to Monticello to spend his remaining time surrounded by books, architecture, science, and the comforts of plantation life. For Sally and her children, however, the future was far less certain. Virginia law precluded slaves from marrying in the same way that free people could marry. That being said, many enslaved couples did form stable common law relationships. This did not apply to Sally Hemings, and the impression we get is that she was considered to be a concubine or pseudo-wife of Jefferson for many, many years. She continued to live in and around the main house on a plantation estate where hundreds of enslaved people lived in other outhouses and slave quarters. Thomas lived to be a very old man by the standards of the time, only dying in 1826 at 83 years of age. By the time he died, Sally was still theoretically a slave. He had never manumitted her slavery, though he did release some of Sally's children from bondage in his last will and testament. Despite his success in the political realm and his vast inherited wealth, Jefferson was a terrible businessman and died bankrupt. A large part of his estate was therefore sold off by Martha Jefferson to repay his debts. This meant that the vast majority of Thomas's slaves were auctioned off, but Sally was not among them. Martha, who was also Sally's half-niece, allowed her to basically live as a free woman thereafter. She spent her final years in Charlottesville with two of her sons and their families. She died there in 1835 at around 62 years of age. As noted, two of Sally's children died in infancy. Harriet was allowed to leave Monticello in 1822 and was even provided with a large sum of money, $50, by Thomas when she left. Although she was still legally a slave at the time, Jefferson never tried to have her return to his estate in Virginia. It's not clear what happened to her. She wrote to her siblings occasionally for a few years after leaving in 1822, but thereafter she largely disappears from the historical record. William Beverly Hemings was apprenticed to the skilled carpenter John Hemings, his uncle, in 1812, at the age of 14. Although Jefferson never formally freed him, Beverly was permitted to leave Monticello as a young man and establish an independent life. In legal terms, he remained enslaved, but in practice he gained his freedom without formal manumission. He chose to identify as a white man in his adult years, highlighting just how light-skinned the children from Sally and Thomas's union would have been. Eston and Madison Hemings were both officially freed by Thomas in his last will and testament. After the death of their mother in 1835, the pair moved with their own families to Ohio, a free state which experienced enormous settlement in the first half of the 19th century. Eston's family later moved on again to Wisconsin in the early 1850s. He died a few years later in 1856. One of his sons, John, was a prominent Union commander in the American Civil War. Madison and his family continued to live in Ohio down to his death in 1873. That same year he published an article in an Ohio newspaper which laid out the claim that he and his siblings were the illegitimate children of the third president of the United States. The DNA testing in 1998 provided powerful evidence linking the descendants of Sally Hemings to the Jefferson family, and her descendants now live across the United States. Yet the story of Sally Hemings is not exceptional because it happened. Tens of millions of Americans have an ancestor of one kind or another who was involved in a relationship between plantation owners and the enslaved. What makes her story remarkable is that it survived. For generations, efforts were made to deny, dismiss, or obscure it. In the end, however, the truth proved harder to bury than the people who lived it. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Sally Hemings. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you want more videos on topics like this, also let me know. And if you want more videos on topics like this, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.